Good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. We have today on the Fixed Flow webinar and look into RCAs, Reinstatement Cost Analysis and Assessment, sorry, how to safeguard your property and budget. Now, first of all, let me go through the administration. So the three of us, myself, Nigel Glen, amongst the various things I do now, I'm a non-exec director of Emeria. James, would you kindly introduce yourself, please?
Hello, my name's James Paul and I'm a director from Earl Kendrick Group and I'm a specialist in reinstatement cost assessments, insurance valuations as they're sometimes known. So look forward to talking to you all over the next half hour or so. Over to you, Joe.
Thanks, James and Nigel. Yeah, I'm Joe Goss, and it's my 5th year with Fixed Flow now, heading up our new business for block management. Really pleased to be on this webinar. It's been a while.
Excellent. Now we've actually got a full hour to go through, but one of the things I want to do is make sure that people do put in questions or come into that. I need to read out the disclaimer. Sad times, but we have to do this. All content presented in this webinar is intended for general information purposes only and should not be used or considered as legal advice or official guidance. Sorry, we have to do that. I always feel a bit odd doing that. Questions. Very much encourage people to ask questions. I've got some questions I want to ask, but also it's very interactive. So feed your questions through. You can see how to there, the Q&A button. I'll moderate them as they come through, try and package them up into relevance, etc., etc. But we do encourage you, and we will take questions during it rather than at the end. So that's off we go. Next slide, please, Mr. Whitty. So what are we going to look at? First of all, what is an RCA? Then how RCAs and insurance are intertwined, which would be no surprise there. And what can you do? Looking at the end, then what you'd be able to go away to do at your desks, etc., etc. So straight in, Joe, you have some personal experience of this, and you wanted to give an anecdote or two just to set the scene as a property manager.
Yeah, unfortunately so, Nigel. Thank you. And we were just talking before we came on live about the statistics around serious losses that a property manager might experience in their career. And we were floating the 1 in 250 blocks will experience a serious claim. And there are some stats about how lucky, unlucky, or careless you might be if you experience 1, 2, or more fires. Personally, I had a couple of quite bad fires in blocks I managed back in the day. One of them a grade 2 star listed building, serious fire in the basement. It had very recently had a proper reinstatement cost assessment. The alternative accommodation costs were enormous. The destruction was significant. It was a back to substrate strip out for basement flats plus significant repair works upstairs. It's a horrible thing to go through, especially when you get dragged through any elements of micromanagement. You've got to meet the loss adjusters, multiple leaseholders, family, and so on. So I think mine's just a cautionary tale. And I don't know how much experience individual people who have on the webinar, because we can't see you all. But if you're starting out, you might just think, oh yeah, insurance, it just gets renewed. Then you might think there's index linking. Great. And then there's this whole world of reinstatement cost assessments. So it's such a serious topic. And I'll hand back to Nigel for questions and James for his expert guidance.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Yeah, as Joe says, I'm sure as a ex-property manager myself, you kind of think an RCA that's just something you send off an email and it's done, isn't it? Tick. But so that brings us to this webinar about, well, what's actually involved in it and why is it important? Which segues into James. What on earth is an RCA? Why is it important? And not being flippant, do you have to do them?
Well, yes, here we go. So an RCA is basically the cost of rebuilding a given building today to modern building regulation requirements and to get it looking more or less the same as its historical original. In contemporary new builds, this might be quite easy to achieve, but for more period buildings, like a grade 2 listed one, for instance, this may be more difficult and it's certainly more expensive. But the higher the building listing may be, the closer the attention to detail that has to be paid towards making it look like a genuinely convincing replica. No, it's not a legal requirement, but many insurers will want to see some sort of methodology behind the insurance sum before they start providing you with cover. And over the years, this methodology has become known as an RCA report. The days of just pulling figures out of the sky and saying, insure it for that amount, well, they're over now, as far as I can tell.
And so how far do you go? I've got a Victorian building in mind, gargoyles and intricate stonework where there's probably nobody alive now who can do that. But how far do you have to go? Do you have to actually put back what was there, or is there a scale that you can kind of say, well, to put that intricate stonework on would be absolutely bonkers, even if we could find a stonemason. So that's not part of it anymore.
So the person that controls the sort of how far do you have to go side of it is basically the local conservation officer. Now, obviously, if you're dealing with a modern block of flats, or even one built 60 years ago in the sort of 60s, 70s, they're probably not going to be that fussed over the exact nature of the replication. And indeed, modern sensible upgrades, UPVC double glazing instead of, aluminium single glazing or whatever was there in the 1970s. No one's going to make a fuss about that. But if we start talking about more historical type things, a grade 1 listed building, York Minster or something like that burning down, yes, you're going to have to go the whole hog. They're going to make you recreate every single gargoyle, probably using, Jurassic limestone and a proper stonemason and the whole gambit. But if you're talking more about a sort of grade 2 listed building that's quite nice and it provides a pleasant vista for the local people, they'll probably still want you to put back something that looks like a gargoyle, but they might allow you to use a GRP replica and then coat it with Sandtex paint or something like that. And I've seen that done before, where cost is an issue, where skills are in short supply. People have to cut their cloth where they have to cut it, and there is normally a sort of balance to be struck between the desires of the conservation officer, what the building was actually insured for, which obviously dictates how much of a payout you can get, and of course modern building regulations and requirements and where they creep in and start acting in conflict towards period structures. So it's often a three-way tug of war, and the gavel lands where it lands, so to speak.
And what about, we're talking about densification in cities now. You're talking there about essentially replacing like with like, but what if the landowner or the building owner says, well, we can only, it's 60 years old, what's burnt down tragically. In those days, we could only build up X stories. Now we can go up to 50. Why don't we build the 50? Now, nobody's going to pay for the 50, but do they just say, well, the sixth one, that would have been 25 million. So here's your 25 million, knock yourself out on the rest of it. Yeah. Does that happen? Or
it does happen. I mean, obviously, the insurers immediately rear up like an angry horse and go, hang on a second, we weren't insuring a 50-story building. But everyone accepts that. And so the payout is probably going to be a hypothetical payout for putting back what was there. But yeah, if the landowner wants to, do a vertical extension and is happy to pay for it and fund it from somewhere, it may prolongate the process a little. Yes, there's going to be more lawyers' fees. You're definitely going to have to go through planning. But hypothetically, there's no real reason why such a deal couldn't be done. It just starts bringing in a lot of questions over forensics and why did this fire actually happen again? And are we absolutely sure it was an accident? And it will throw more of a microscope on a lot of things if somebody tried to do something like that. But in theory, no, there's nothing to stop it happening.
So that's interesting. We just threw in the word forensics there. So yeah, I guess the fire brigade attends and they look at it and go, "This looks a bit odd. This doesn't, if you pardon the pun, smell right."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, fortunately, there's not too much, deliberate arson going on, and of course, buildings are very rarely insured against arson. If you look in the terms and conditions of a typical buildings insurance policy, if the freeholder themselves or a representative of the freeholder or sometimes even a leaseholder sets fire to their own building for whatever reason, quite often it's an exclusion and no one can get any money. So this is something to be aware of if you are, insuring something that maybe has people that I think are potentially going to sort of set fire to their own premises.
What about indirectly aiding and abetting? I'm thinking of a hoarder. So they don't intend to burn the block down, but my lord, are they going to make it a high risk?
Well, I think, yeah, that probably doesn't meet the legal test
Okay.
of true arson. I mean, check with a lawyer, but it's more the case of it, what this is trying to sort of prevent against is an unscrupulous freeholder owns a given building. It's getting quite dilapidated. They don't really want to spend any money fixing it, so they deliberately start a fire surreptitiously, and the whole thing burns down. And they think to themselves, I'm going to be able to get a massive payout and rebuild a nice new building without using any of my own money. And that's really what the exclusion is there to stop. It's not really designed in mind to catch out every kind of accidental fire that could have maybe been prevented if people were being a bit more careful.
Okay. Sorry, I wandered down a little side street there. So property manager, I think I need an RCA. I ring you up, and then a few weeks later, back in the post or the email comes the RCA. Now, there's an awful lot that's happened between those two that, as a property manager, I've got no visibility into. So, what's actually involved? What do? First of all, do you have to go to site? Because we've all heard of desktop ones. If you do have to go to site, what are you actually looking at? What do you need from the managing agent in advance, or is it nothing, etc.? What constitutes getting an RCA back to the property manager?
Well, assuming it's a full physical assessment in distilled format, with all RCAs, it's basically an area times rate sum. That's all it is. A building has a given area. There are various ways that you can work out the area of a building, but the RICS guidance lays down to surveyors precisely how they should do this. And then we come to the rate part of it, which is the subjective bit, which often produces differences of professional opinion between surveyors. And the sorts of things that a surveyor is going to want to see and know before forming their rate in their head or on a spreadsheet, as is more often the case, are a detailed understanding of the exterior of the building, every side of it, the interior, what sort of fit out it has on the inside, all those parts, and maybe the parts of the building that the average resident does not necessarily go into every day. So that might include basement level plant rooms, outbuildings, perhaps even the roof if it's accessible. And then they're going to start doing more of a desktop analysis. They're going to look at plans, building information, any kind of documentation a property manager might have on file already. And they will ask specifics if they have any questions. And all of this goes into the mix. And through the surveyor's experience of the construction process, out comes a selection of rates for different parts of the building. So the underground car park might have one rate. The main residential bit might have another rate. The shop on the corner might have a separate rate. The plant room might have a separate rate, and so on. And they put it together like a big jigsaw puzzle and eventually come up with a declared value. And that's essentially how it happens. But when it comes to desktop assessments, and this is the sort of RCA where a surveyor does not actually physically go out to a property, but instead tries to do it all online using things like Google Earth and Google Maps and photos that people have maybe emailed in. We'll probably discuss this later in the talk, no doubt, but you're essentially asking the surveyor to do the same thing, but with one hand tied behind their back and for probably half the fee. You're asking them to come up with a number without them necessarily having an intimate knowledge and understanding of the building. You know, they may never have been to that building before. They may never have even been to the town that the building is located in before. So they have a much more vague and general understanding of what that place is like. And so factors like the topography, the land, the inside particularly, and any facade that isn't readily visible from a public road may not be as well understood as if they had gone there physically. And that's really why desktop RCAs are inferior to full physical ones.
And a comment's just come in from somebody called Anonymous about it could be a false economy, to summarize what they're saying, which is it's cheaper, I'm going to imagine, to do a desktop analysis because there's nobody going out. But the desktop person is going to, quote, cover their butt. I've put that. Yeah. And so build fat in just in case. And so actually the end users will probably end up paying more in terms of premium, etc., because of that sort of security blanket.
Absolutely. And this is the issue. Desktop RCAs are kind of a bit more of a rough and ready figure. The thinking is you probably won't end up underinsured, but you probably will end up overinsured. And of course, if you end up overinsured, you're effectively flushing money down the toilet when it comes to your insurance broker and the premium you're paying, because you're insuring a building that maybe would only cost £5 million to rebuild for perhaps 5.5 million or maybe even 6 million. And of course, no one really wants to do that if they can have a cheaper insurance policy and insure for a more accurate amount. The analogy I often give people is we've probably all hired a car at some point from Avis or Enterprise or whoever. And you know how you kind of have to give the car back with the same amount of fuel that you took it away on, and it's always a bit of a guessing game. I always try and get it right on the needle, and I'm often wrong. And we've all probably been there, going out to local, yeah, putting in 3 litres at the BP garage, and people looking at you like you're strange and stuff. And well, imagine I said to you, I want you to drive my car from London to Glasgow, and you're going to have to fill it up at the beginning with exactly the right amount of fuel to get to Glasgow, and any excess that's in the tank at the end of the journey I get to keep as my little Brucey bonus. Well, that's a bit like doing a desktop RCA. You don't necessarily know what kind of car I've got. You don't necessarily know whether it's a diesel or a petrol or what its sort of consumption is. Yes, you know that London to Glasgow is roughly 400 miles, but that's all the information you've got. So you have to kind of guesstimate how much fuel you're going to need, and you're probably going to slightly overestimate because no one wants the car to run out of fuel. And that is a bit like what doing a desktop RCA is for a surveyor.
Is it worth confirming difference on declared value and then sum insured based on that?
Absolutely. So this is one that often gets people talking. The declared value is the hypothetical sum that it would cost to rebuild a given day on the same day that the surveyor went out and assessed it, assuming that all the different construction trades and processes and things could happen all in one day. So it's a hypothetical nonsense, but imagine you could build an entire house in one day, from digging out the foundations to putting on the door handle of the last front door, and literally then give someone the keys at 5 o'clock and say, walk in, it's all finished for you. So no house gets built like that in reality, but that is effectively what a day one declared value is. And the sum insured basically includes some padding, which allows the 3-year period of which an RCA is sort of valid for to be covered under inflationary events, but also the rebuilding time frame. So most typical low-rise estate houses will take the best part of a year to be built from start to finish, even with efficient developers. And a lot of big blocks of flats and kind of buildings in urban town centres and things, they might take 2 or 3 years, especially if there's been some complicated forensic fire investigation at the start of the process. So it's quite normal for a building in a real life reinstatement scenario to be completed and finished maybe 3 years after it originally burnt down, and perhaps 6 years after the last RCA was conducted for the old building before it burnt down. So you may be looking at 5 or 6 years worth of inflation there. So that's why you often have declared values for, let's say, £5 million and sums insured for, let's say, 6 million. And it's often done by the insurance broker using a sort of round number percentage uplift, like 30%, 25%, 50%, whatever. And the broker kind of just agrees it with the policyholder and just sort of says, what kind of inflation provision do you want? Do you want 30%, 40%, 50%? And they just say, and they get given it. And that's what it is, basically.
And I guess they've got to take, sorry, Joe.
It sounds like there's a careful conversation around that element of fat, going back to the question.
Absolutely. Yeah. So something like Canary Wharf Tower is going to have a much bigger inflation provision than, say, my house, depending on the size and the risk. And really a lot of it is to do with the height of the building, because obviously a taller and bigger building is going to take longer to rebuild than a smaller and a shorter one. But yeah, 30% is quite common, 50% is becoming more common. And for tall towers and big complicated commercial things, I've seen 100% and even higher on occasion.
So crystal balls are notoriously difficult. So you do an RCA and something terrible happens, and it just happens that Battersea Power Station finally kicks off and hoovers up every single brick in the country, which is exactly what happened. So your cost, your actual cost of reinstating is going to be substantially off. Now, does the insurer just go, that's just tough, that's what happens, we'll pay some more? Or do they go, that's your problem, because all you're going to get is 25 million. And I suppose my next question on that is, what happens if somebody sadly practically what happens if somebody sadly has got the RCA wrong and you can't rebuild at that cost for whatever reason? We'll forget suing the guy, the person who did the RCA because they got it wrong. What actually happens?
Well, the first sort of example you gave of,
No
the
bricks.
prices of bricks quadrupling as Battersea Power Station has just kicked off or something like that. That's what quantity surveyors would call fluctuations in certain materials. So thankfully for the insured, and even I think for the insurer, that sort of situation is fairly well understood, and it's covered essentially by the inflation provision. So as well as covering the period since the last RCA and the period of rebuilding, sums insured and inflation provisions are supposed to take the flak for any kind of materials fluctuation costs. And certain building materials are well known for going up and down like yo-yos. Tarmac, which is composed of bitumen, pretty much tracks the price of oil. Steel goes up and down with the global economy price, and a lot of that is to do with how well China's doing at the moment. Copper tends to go up just before we have a boom and tends to go down just before we have a bust. And, you do get quite a lot of copper in buildings, pipes and so on. And other things like concrete and timber historically have been a little bit more stable. So the nice thing about reinstatement cost assessments is that you don't necessarily have to build a building exactly with the same materials that it was done with 30 years before. So if you've got a steel framed building, and steel is particularly expensive at the time you're rebuilding it, most planners, conservation officers, architects, etc., will let you rebuild it using a concrete frame, assuming it doesn't really detrimentally disadvantage the room sizes, the look of the building, and building regulations and so on. So you can switch from concrete to steel and steel to concrete and timber to this, and make adjustments in the similar way that you would do with other building materials and advances in technology. So thankfully, fluctuations in material labour costs, they do happen. They are borne by the inflation provision when they do, but there's often ways of working around them so that you don't have to spend an exorbitant amount on rebuilding a given building, dependent on what's going on in the global marketplace at the time.
Well, another question that's occurred to me, and please don't be insulted by this, James, but I'm presuming when you go into a block, you're looking at the plant as well. So let's say it's got a very sophisticated heat network system. Are you, this is where I'll try not to insult you, are you sufficiently aware of that technology to be able to accurately give a replacement cost? Or do you go to a third party and say, look at this, what on earth do we do with this thing?
Yeah. So it sort of depends on how regularly we see it. If it's something like your sort of everyday plant and machinery that you get in most normal buildings, lifts, escalators, communal boiler systems, even backup generators, BMS and combined heat and power units, and we at L. Kendrick see this sort of thing all the time, and we very much know what it kind of costs, especially in the sort of level of detail you need to in order to do an RCA. If it's something a little bit more exotic, if it's something we genuinely have never come across before, like, I don't know, an RCA on a car manufacturing plant, and obviously assembly lines, they're all a little bit bespoke and they're all a bit different. And if there's, robots doing this sort of stuff and welding cars together and stuff, I'm not going to know how much that sort of thing costs. And that's when we defer to, a quantity surveyor and so on. And we do actually have a cost consultancy division within L. Kendrick that does do things like that. So when you're dealing with something of a genuine, specific nature, it's worth getting a steer from someone who really knows the answer. And because we conduct our RCAs under the elemental form rather than the functional unit rate method, which I'll come on to later, we're able to sort of capture these sorts of things and put them into our figures so that it's reflected in the end result.
I suspect that's going to, I mean, Joe and I were talking about, you've got your vanilla resi buildings, which we've all got in our head at the moment, but you are going to have mixed use buildings. You're going to have the ground floor, I'm sure you had loads of these. Ground floor is shops, Tesco's, or all sorts of things. What happens then? Does that I must change it surely, because okay, we don't have car manufacturing plants down there, but it's a different use.
Absolutely. So where you have mixed use buildings, normally what we tend to find, if it's all the same freeholder, is they'll want a figure for the full and total reinstatement of the residential parts, the flats, the staircases and so on leading up to them. And normally a full reinstatement of the sort of external shell and envelope of the building, which may cover, the shop fronts of whatever commercial units are down on the ground floor. But normally, in most scenarios, the actual internal premises, whether it's, I don't know, a Tesco Metro or a Burger King or whatever that's down there on the ground floor, normally the interiors of those commercial units are insured by the commercial tenants themselves. And this is what's called in my trade a Cat A valuation, or sometimes a shell and core valuation, which is actually slightly different to a Cat A, but for the sake of this, we'll just pretend they're the same thing. And that's where you basically give the commercial tenant a sort of bare concrete box back, sort of screeded floor, plastered walls, a few wires hanging from the ceiling, but that's about all they get in terms of commercial fit out. And then everything else, the internal fit out, is left to their own insurer to reinstate, and they can then turn it back into a McDonald's or a Burger King or a, Morrison's supermarket or whatever it used to be or whatever it will become. And that's the sort of methodology that we use to sort of separate the landlord's parts away from the tenant's parts, which in most cases are their own domain.
Okay. Now, there's a question come through which I might come around to that in a second, because it's a finesse of a question I have here. Let's say there's two blocks side by side.
Mm.
One of them, they've gone gangbusters and kept it beautiful. The other one, it's gone to seed. Now they're both built exactly the same area, same everything. How do you take into account the fact that one of them is, to put it nicely, tatty, and the other is still pristine? So how do you take into account state of disrepair, if you like, of a building? Because it wouldn't be fair if both of them paid the same and both got brand new buildings back, would it?
Yeah, so this is an interesting grey area. So generally speaking, most of the time, the extent of dilapidation in a given building is ignored with reinstatement cost assessment. So your tatty building would have a similar sort of reinstatement value as your pristine building. The only time where the DVs would fluctuate a bit is maybe if the internal fit out, regardless of its state and condition, was eminently more expensive on one side to the other. So if one block of flats was just full of pog and pole kitchens and really nice sort of oak engineered flooring and stuff like that, yeah, that's going to have a higher cost than something that's just got a basic developer's kitchen and vinyl lino going everywhere. But if they were both, of the same specification, but one was really tatty and one was really well kept, actually, they probably have pretty much the same rebuild value, because reinstatement cost assessments in the main ignore dilapidation. The only time when they take it into account is if you are commissioning what's called a depreciated reinstatement cost assessment. And this is a rather exotic form of RCA that we don't do very often, but we do sometimes get asked for. And normally it's for very, very dilapidated commercial or industrial sites that are, probably going to be turned into something else or bulldozed or very, very heavily refurbished soon. But for the time being, the landowner is trying to insure them for something, not necessarily their full rebuild value, but a given figure, so that in the event of, a massive fire taking place or whatever, they get some sort of compensatory payout. So we probably all think of a building in our heads near to our, where we live, that's been, sort of boarded up and closed for 10 years, and maybe it's an old pub and you're waiting for someone to sort of finally kick out the pigeons and do something with it. That's probably being insured on a DRC price, I would imagine, because buildings that are severely dilapidated, that don't have any kind of finance attached to them, that have a notional value, but it's a bit arbitrary as to what it is, because you'd need to do so many repairs to it to get it back up to standard. It would kind of just be stupid to insure it for its full rebuild cost, because the insurers themselves would have an issue with it. That is a situation where you might call in for a DRC assessment, and then you are allowed to basically take off the cost of dilapidations from the actual rebuild cost on a new for old state.
Sounds like there are so many variables, James.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nigel. I was just thinking, if I was setting up my prompt to get a reinstatement cost assessment done at a building I look after through say fixed flow or other systems, how often should I be prompting it? Does it depend on the building or something else, or accommodation?
So what the RCAs guidance says is once every 3 years, a major review should take place. And we generally take this to mean a full reinstatement cost assessment. So even if you don't think the building has changed very much, it's worth getting a surveyor down there just to redo the whole thing all over again. And this is important because 9 times out of 10, that will be a different surveyor to the one that went there 3 years before. And they might pick up on something or notice something that the previous surveyor hadn't. And that's not to say the previous surveyor's negligent or did it quickly or whatever, but it's just a second pair of eyes sometimes spots something that wasn't necessarily there before. And a lot of the time we do this and find little queries and questions, and sometimes it is because somebody's just built a new garage and it wasn't there before, and then that's affected the declared value, it's gone up slightly, or it might be someone's put on a ground floor conservatory extension or something like that, or maybe there really has been a substantial refurbishment of the place in the past 3 years, and there's perhaps LED emergency lighting going up the internal common parts with brand new carpets and all the rest of it. And that's not actually really going to have a massive effect on the declared value for the reasons that we just said in the previous point. But it's worth taking into account, and all of these little factors feed into the end result, which is, of course, the new declared value, taking into account recent inflation. So 3 years is the recommendation. There are certain very high profile buildings in London, whether the owners conduct RCAs every single year or every 2 years, especially along the Thames and along, famous bits of the city and the Docklands. But for most typical blocks of flats and things in the provinces, once every 3 years is adequate.
Yeah, that feeds into the next question, doesn't it, a little bit?
It does. But before I get into that, you mentioned major work. So the property managers sitting on this call, if some of them have got some major works going on, what sort of major works / what extent would trigger, instead of waiting for the next 2 years, because we had an RCA last year, better get another one done. What sort of, because that's useful to know in budgeting as well. If we do this major works now, we've also got an RCA to do. What sort of things and what quantum? Obviously, if you're just painting one wall, but if you're painting the whole block, as you said, that might trigger it. What triggers you to reassess an RCA? Or
I think whenever there's been a substantial change in the building, so someone building an extension, that would probably trigger it. Someone repainting a wall, that probably wouldn't. If the building's size, if its area changes, you're definitely into new RCA territory. So if anyone does a vertical extension or converts a loft or builds on a new wing or something like that, or even just kind of sorts out the car park and puts in a few cycle shelters and maybe sort of redesigns the garden and the landscaping. These things have a cost, and if you're wanting to stay right on the money, it's worth getting your assets reassessed even before the 3-year anniversary.
Okay. Now, the question here that came through, which I think Joe's looking at, was somebody has said, and it segues into something you said before, but let's say you've got a block of flats, 10 stories, the bottom 9 are, okay, nice. But the top one, the penthouse, boy, have they gone crazy. Everything is coated in gold, diamonds, and platinum with, built-out kitchens and so forth. Do you need to make sure the assessor goes into that flat and goes, oh my God, and does that affect the premium? And the third one is a lease question, which I'll come over to you on, Joe, about should that person then pay a disproportionate amount, which I suspect I know the answer to. But James, what's the case where somebody's really gone, I love this phrase, gangbusters, or the full Tonto on doing their place up?
It happens quite a bit, and sometimes in the most surprising of areas. Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yeah, if they really have gone crazy, it's worth getting the surveyor to see that flat. And what we sometimes do to help property managers is to give a report back that says something like, look, judging by most of the flats in this block that we've kind of seen and been told about, overall the block would be this value, but because flat 12 has gone completely crazy, that particular flat, even though it's no bigger than any of the rest, literally has a rebuild value that's double all the rest of them. So this places a distortion in the shares and costs that the residents would be contributing, because in most leases they are silent on apportionment of insurance costs. And so the leaseholders often find themselves in situations where the majority are paying a little bit more for a minority of occupants who have gone completely crazy on their levels of fit out. And there's not always a huge amount that the property manager can do. But where leases are silent, if you have an RMC or an RTM committee that are reasonably, communicative, you can agree to split the costs in an apportioned fashion, which your surveyor can help you with. We can certainly help you with it at our Kendrick. And that will enable the property manager to say, the insurance is £10,000 this year, there's 12 of you, but because of what flat 12 has done, they're paying £2,000 of this 10, and everyone else is just splitting 8,000 between the 11 of you, or whatever. And that sometimes makes for a fairer split. And if it can be agreed between the RTM directors and the residents, even if the lease is silent, normally it's an acceptable way of doing it.
Joe and I are both grinning. Joe, what do you think on that one?
Well, I'm thinking it's better to have an open communication about it. I mean, I was fortunate on one where a fairly well-known entrepreneur had created a substantial extension, and he actually just said, and we're going to pay more towards the building's insurance. We know, we've taken advice. I suspect that might not be the norm. Then I would defer to the lease. James, you've touched on what the terms of the lease are and what the apportionment does. I think on more modern blocks, the apportionment, it may still be deemed unfair by fellow leaseholders. So I think it's going to come back to communication, try and resolve it without disputes based on reasonableness, and failing that, then you're going to have to go and talk to a friendly leasehold lawyer.
Yeah.
Great advice.
Well, Mr. Channing has chipped one in. I think you have to be a bit careful, because he's saying, basically, in a nutshell, should we publicize more insurance horror stories in terms of underinsurance to stop property managers being quite so blasé about them? Now, I think communal living is already toxic enough no matter what happens, so I don't think we want to quite go that far. But how do we, apart from webinars like this, how do we get across the importance of RCAs? Because if I'm blunt, when I was a property manager, RCAs was just one of those things that I had on a tick box to do. And you just assumed that the professional you engaged, and you still have to assume that, I guess, did it correctly. But how often are the underinsurance issues happening? Is it unicorn, or is it actually happening far more than we want it to? And if so, how do we address that?
Well, in my experience, underinsurance is still a problem. We quite often find that buildings that have not had an RCA historically in recent memory, or no one knows, why they're insuring it for a given figure, but it's just always been around that level, so they've just always insured it for that level. Those are the ones where you often find that the declared value is woefully inadequate, and you're doubling, tripling, sometimes even quadrupling what they were insuring for, and there's a massive steward's inquiry when your report lands. But for buildings that are having RCAs done by, surveying practices and stuff every 3 years, inflation goes up, and normally we're turning up the volume on each successive time, but the increases and the jumps aren't quite so bad. And sometimes we even find situations where we can reduce insurance levels. It's happened a few times recently in the past year for us, and normally this is because the last RCA was a desktop, and so we regularly kind of find that desktops are pitching declared values at around 20% more than what a full physical inspection would have probably pitched it at had the
Is that the
freehold.
safety buffer we talked about? I'm doing it from a
Yeah,
desk, so I need to put some fat in there.
exactly. So we often pick up the other end of it 3 years later, where someone who's had a desktop in, let's say, 2021, what then does a sort of full physical in 2024, and we produce our report quite often blind without knowing what the desktop assessor has said 3 years ago. Send our report in, let's say it's £10 million. And then the client falls straight up and says, have you got your sums right here? Are you sure about this? Because we were told it was £10 million 3 years ago. And, inflation, inflation, inflation. And normally the answer is, oh, yes, but would you mind sending over the report or telling us if it was a desktop the last time you had an RCA report done? And 9 times out of 10, it is because it was a desktop, and desktops regularly basically bloat insurance figures and make them higher than is necessary. So, yeah, a lot of the time, the devil's in the detail, and that's your answer.
I've got a quick question on that. Sorry, Nigel.
No, far away.
I'm just really interested about, and James's opinion. Is there a sector of the market where underinsurance is perhaps more prevalent? I'm kind of asking for a friend, and I know someone who they're working on quite new developments, and there was an incident. I just wonder if that is like, okay, your reaction maybe says it.
Yeah, it's a surprisingly common situation, and you've absolutely nailed it. Yeah, so new build sites are regularly, in my experience, insured for less than it would cost to rebuild them, even the day that they're marketed with estate agents. And after a lot of talking to people about this strange anomaly, I think I've kind of understood why it keeps happening. And it's all to do with property developers. Property developers, I know we all love to hate them. They're actually incredibly clever people, very, very astute, and they really know what they're doing. And they tend to have very good rates with very good tradespeople, and they can build buildings incredibly efficiently. They maybe spend months and sometimes even years land banking certain sites and considering certain schemes and choosing the precise finishes and designs and materials choices to make a given building not only look amazing to you or I, but also to cost very, very little in the grand scheme of it for a contractor to build. And then when it burns down 2 years later, quite often they find themselves woefully underinsured, because the sorts of contractors and rates that a big insurer like Aviva or AXA or whoever might be using to rebuild buildings are going to be charging a lot more than the developer's mate, who happens to be, a building contractor. And as a result of this, the figures given by developers to the property managers of brand new estates are often way under what it would actually cost in a real world situation to rebuild the buildings on an accelerated time frame. So possibly the biggest sort of the best example I've ever had of a new build estate that was underinsured was a few years ago. I undertook an RCA on a big, kind of mixed use residential development that went on for acres and acres near Luton. And it was being insured by the people that were running the site as estate managers for about £60 million. And we did an RCA on it without knowing what they were insuring it for, and came back with a figure of 101 million. So, almost double, solid sort of, massive increase on their insurance. And of course, we double checked all our figures and looked at all of our areas and sat down in great depth with the team that had produced this £60 million figure. And we found out that not only were their costs based on tender prices from 3 years earlier, from when they actually let the contract, but they weren't including for professional fees, demolition costs, VAT, or even certain external items like access roads and sort of car parking and stuff like this that someone had just forgotten to add it in. So we see it a lot on new builds. New builds are regularly, issued with rebuild figures that are not quite really, enough to rebuild them in a real world situation. And the best advice that I can give any property or estate manager that's taking hold of a big estate from Away or Persimmon or whoever, just get an RCA done. Don't assume you'll be all right for the first few years, because you probably won't be.
And being blunt, does that shift the responsibility from the property managing agent to the assessor's firm? James came in, we paid him, and that's the number he said, and he was massively wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, if you're a surveyor and if you're producing RCA reports, you are sticking your neck on the line and you
Yeah.
are opening yourself up to, potentially being sued if you've got your sums wrong. And that applies if you're undervaluing stuff just as much as if you're overvaluing it. But generally, you're less likely to get hauled over the coals for overvaluing something just because it's a bit more subjective and a bit harder to sort of prove unless you really, really overvalued it. And then yes, you will be toast. But yeah, and that's why desktop RCAs generally end up with bloated, higher than necessary figures. It's surveyors being cautious, being conservative, not wanting to get sued, and because they don't really understand the building or how far back it goes, or whether it has a sneaky little lower ground floor or basement at the back that you can't quite see. That's how those sort of buildings get overvalued, if you like.
So you might not be able to answer this. When you get the old desktops and you look at them, is it kind of, oh, it's always the facade they get wrong, or it's always the roof they get wrong? Is it usually a certain thing, or is it everything's always different?
It varies. I think generally the rates are always higher than necessary. So on a desktop scenario from 3 years ago, I might see someone valuing it at 2,400 net rebuild per square meter, and I'd be thinking, yeah, I'd be able to value it for less than that now, even today, having gone and seen it. But I can often understand the quandary they're in, because I can put myself in their shoes and think to myself, gosh, if I'd never even been to this building before, if I'd had to do it all from Google Earth, in the middle of lockdown and all the rest of it, yeah, I'd probably say it was 2,400 as well, because you have to be cautious. And this is the sort of stuff that happens. But where you do see, if you like, mistakes or inaccuracies is on building area, and often it is because someone has imagined a basement that isn't there, or put in a full front to back floor story that's only goes halfway back, but you can't see that from the road and it looks ambiguous or something like that. And unfortunately, when the area of the building goes out of kilter, the mistakes and the inaccuracies get really, really badly amplified. And then you can end up with sort of swings on the sort of 30-40% spectrum. And you can see, an £11 million building becoming 16 million, or a £12 million building becoming 8 million. And when stuff like that happens, there are a lot of questions asked, normally to the surveyor that's issuing the new report and delivering the bad news. But quite often they're not the ones in the wrong. It's the people before them from 3 years ago that just made a schoolboy error. And they're very easy to make if you're doing desktop RCAs.
Now, a question from a property manager's perspective, and thinking of their insurance policies. You've gone in, you've done an RCA, you said it's 25 million. What does that not cover? The property manager needs to make sure the insurers cover, housing everybody in Kensington for 5 years, or the legal fees or professional fees. The RCA, I'm presuming, isn't, anything terrible happens, that'll just see you through and you'll get a brand new building in X years' time. Everything else is covered. There's got to be, I'm assuming there's stuff missing out of there. So what do the property managers need to think about?
So it's really a conversation with your insurance broker. It depends on the exact nature of your building, but the sorts of things that you would then talk to your insurance broker on are things like terrorism cover, things like alternative accommodation and how long that alternative accommodation goes on for. Things like contents insurance. Most people know, but not everyone knows. Contents, furniture, furnishings aren't included under the building's insurance. So you need to make sure all your nice sort of hot plants and sofas and various other things in the internal common parts are being insured by somebody. And of course, the internal environment of the flats, people's actual possessions, they're not covered either.
So yeah, the ubiquitous sofa in the reception room, of course, isn't a common area, isn't a content under anybody else's insurance. So you've kind of got to have a contents insurance for the common areas, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, a typical insurance policy will just cover a notional sort of £20,000 worth of common area furnishings, which is normally way more than is necessary for anything that's there. But do you know what? If you're insuring a lovely, grade 2 listed building full of interesting antiquities and stuff like that, you possibly should get, an itinerary made up by an arts and antiquities valuer and an insurance figure put behind every single one of them. Because if you've got 300-year-old paintings on the wall in the internal common parts and nice, sort of, French polished Georgian furniture and suits of armor at the door and stuff like this, I mean, these things are not buildings insurance. They are contents, and they might not be covered under a generic buildings insurance policy in the contents figure. So you probably do need to seek expert advice to value them.
So Joe, coming to you, you've sadly had the misfortune of a couple of fires. What were the bits that happened, if any, that you weren't prepared for? The stuff that came from left field, outside of just rebuilding it.
I mean, we had a really thorough policy actually, and there weren't huge amounts of common parts contents. I think the stuff that really came from the left field, which was challenging, was around the building's insurance liaising with leaseholders and their contents of things that were going into storage whilst that flat was being stripped out and remediated. So not so much an insurance matter, but it was just the practical implications for the poor property manager having to almost micromanage that.
Okay. And when, James, back to you, sorry, I know it's turning a bit of a monologue, but the expert on the RCA, what we mentioned at the beginning that you're going to go in and do an RCA. What do you typically say to the property manager? This is the stuff I need before I go in. FRAs, or what info do you need from them?
So I generally ask for FRAs, asbestos reports, plans, site plans, really important. Anything that like previous RCA, building survey report, whatever they've got on their system. I'm very used to sort of leafing through it. So the typical scenario is someone will give me a load of documents on a big Dropbox dump, and I'll just sift through it and find the things that I want. And at the end of it, if I have any questions, I'll come back to them and I'll say, obviously I'm coming down to see this soon, but it sounds like there is a, I don't know, boarded up basement void or something that's closed to residents. Is there any chance we could get in and see it? And this happened once. It was very interesting. I did an RCA on a converted mental hospital. And they had an entire basement catacomb that was sort of sealed off and boarded off from the
I've seen movies that have that in.
Yeah, it was a bit like a movie. It wasn't actually that far off Halloween when I inspected, so it was quite timeless. And sure enough, we got special permission to go into the basement, accompanied by the estates manager. And there was some incredible stuff down there. These old sort of what you'd call them really, but restraining rooms, old padded cells from the 1960s, almost like something out of The Shining, and it was all sort of covered in dust and hadn't been used for years, but it was technically part of the building, and it had even though it wasn't really being used by the residents, it wasn't being trafficked very regularly, it was still down there, and it had a value. And we had a massive conversation with the insurer over how to insure it and how to value it, because you can't really have a building hovering in midair with something underneath it that you're just ignoring because it's not being used. It's part of the building, whether you like it or not, and it has to be insured. So we eventually ended up including it, even though there was never being used. It sent the insurance up massively, that people were upset about, but at least we had a reason as to why it had done that. And because it was a grade 2 listed building, and because all these different leaseholders had mortgages on their flats and all the rest of it, we couldn't do a DRC assessment and just discount the dilapidation as you might do in a more normal situation. And so now they're insuring this massive sort of museum of old, asylum rooms and equipment. And I think the last time I spoke to that particular site, they were thinking about turning it into a big gym for the residents, but it was going to cost a lot of money. So that's again been shelved. So you come across some interesting things in this line of work, and interesting situations. And generally speaking, the more methodical and comprehensive you are, the more stuff comes out of the woodwork.
Good property managers need to keep their documents in good order, ready to send to you, James. It sounds like the key takeaway there. Just as a minor plug for any of our fixed flow customers on this, just in case they've forgotten, they can bulk download specific documents for such instances.
But we talked about that, Joe,
Yeah.
just in general of that's the way property management is going, that the golden threads, et cetera, et cetera. Part of property management now is managing stonking amounts of data, indexing it,
Yes.
making sure it's being kept up to date, et cetera, et cetera. It's not funny. Got somebody who's whoever's put this in will probably hate me. It's a bit of a rail against the insurance hikes and so forth. But how big a problem is over insurance? Is that from terms of the RCA? I think we'll have to park the bit about the insurance quote taking the Mickey during a time of inflation, et cetera, et cetera. But how we've said under insurance is obviously a terrible danger, but over insurance is that very prevalent? I guess it's going to come back again to proportion of desktops.
Yeah, we have come across some quite serious overinsurance situations. It's often difficult to understand why the previous assessor got it wrong, because you don't always see their calculations and everything. You just get the headline figure on the report. But once or twice, I've been able to work it out and understand what's going wrong. So the classic example is underground car parks. Surveyors who are a little bit fast and loose with their calculation will sometimes just assume that an underground car park is exactly the same shape and size as the ground floor of the building. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's only half the size or a quarter of the size, or it only goes back over the first wing. It doesn't include, the bits of the rear and so on. And so we've seen a lot of overinsurance situations where people have just said the underground car park is 3 times bigger than it really is. You also get some of the major household name real estate firms that perhaps aren't experts in RCAs, but sometimes get given some of the most prominent buildings in the country, like Battersea Power Station, for instance, and they'll conduct an RCA on it because they've got the £50 million PI cover and the global sort of name, and everyone kind of assumes they know what they're doing, and so on. And they're the same sorts of people that will often produce incredibly bloated and over the top insurance figures that everyone's scared to challenge because they're the global brand and presumably know what they're doing. But then someone like me comes along 3 years later and just looks at it and just goes, this is absolutely crazy. I can't even make this half the amount that they've said. And then you end up having very long Zoom calls with people explaining it all. But it is just a nature of the business. When you're talking about very, very prominent, skyscrapers and tower blocks, sometimes even the best minds in the business just get it wrong, or maybe don't get it wrong, but they're just very, very cautious with their rates and contingencies and apply a lot of padding. And if that figure then gets index linked over a few years, it can get completely out of control.
Yeah, compound interest. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to give Joe a minute at the end, but James, property managers have watched this, and hopefully they're not going to go away and just go, "Oh, that was interesting," and then forget about it. What should they? What's the one thing you would say? Go back to your desk after this. Well, hopefully you're sitting at it. What should they do? The one thing they should take away and do after this.
Well, I would say go back to your portfolios, double check that all of your sites have an RCA that was produced after December 2021. Any further back than that, and your site will be approaching its 3-year RCA anniversary and will be in need of a new one, or it may even have passed it. And it's time to get your site revalued. Just send in a simple list of addresses and postcode and unit numbers to us, and we can price it for you. Or better still, raise a job on FixFlow.
Oh, that's kind of you, James.
Just before we jump to Joe, some angry anonymous has come back to me saying my point about overinsurance was directly in relation to insurers asking for big index-linked hikes. I don't think that point should be parked. I'm not parking it. It's just that's not in with this at the moment. The RCA is about working out the replacement cost, whereas insurers linking to various indices, I think, is a separate discussion to have on insurance policies and how you price those, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not putting aside.
Insurers love to do index linking because it's a great way of cranking up the declared value and therefore cranking up the premium. And what I would say is index linking is the most inferior form of making sure you're right on the money. Above that, you've got desktop RCAs. I wouldn't recommend desktop RCAs, but they exist and they are a thing and they are better than index linking. And above that, gold standard that I'd always recommend, go to a reinstatement cost assessment professional specialist like ourselves and order a physical site inspection, RCA, and make sure that the assessor that's doing it is using the elemental form of cost assessment and not just looking at functional unit rates and blending it all up and producing a quick figure for spending 5 minutes on BCIS. And if you're doing those things, you're buying quality, and you will be looking after the interests of your stakeholders, ensuring that they're not under-insuring, but just insuring for the exact, specific, accurate, right on the money answer, which is of course what everyone wants, because no one wants to be rushing away money.
So basically, doing the site visit RCA unlinks that index link, if you know what I mean. Joe, sorry, I really want to get back to you for that.
We're on the dot, aren't we? Well, that was fascinating. Thank you for joining the webinar, everyone. If you'd like to learn more about FixFlow, you can scan the QR code on the screen now, or do fill out the survey that will pop up when you leave the webinar. We'd really love to hear from you on what you would like us to talk about in the next webinars. We have a number planned, so please let us know in the feedback. Thanks for coming, and we hope to see you again in the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.